In this first of two videos, I summarize a half-dozen major deficiencies I have seen in forest carbon product design from my professional experience over the past year working as a technical reviewer for the VCS. There's been a lot of publicity, both in the popular press and in peer-reviewed journals, regarding deficiencies in forest carbon projects. I wanted to discuss some of these deficiencies in greater depth from my own first-hand professional experience as a technical reviewer. My role was to review projects at the final step after approved audits by BBBs, but still prior to registration or issuance by the VCS. My goal here is not to criticize the forest carbon market, since I work in the sector, but rather to assist project developers in obtaining positive validation and verification opinions, as opposed to getting caught in costly review rounds to close findings. I therefore recast these deficiencies as obstacles for project developers to avoid or overcome. First, let's define the two steps of the forest carbon audit process of validation and verification, both of which require desk and field audits by a VVB hired by the project proponent. Note that validation is typically done once at the inception of the project for registration and is based on the project description or PD. Validation is defined by the VCS as the independent assessment of the project by a VBB, or validation verification body, that determines whether the project conforms with the VCS program rules and evaluates its reasonableness. Verification may occur simultaneously with validation and also must occur periodically, often a minimum of every 5 years, for the life of the project. Verification is based on the monitoring report, or MR. After verification, ex-ante offsets, or VCUs, then become ex post, meaning that these offsets can then be issued on the registry for sale and retirement. Verification is defined by the VCS as a periodic ex post independent assessment by a VBB of the GHG emission reductions and removals that have occurred as a result of the project. So to summarize, verification is an assessment of the offset quantities, whereas validation, occurring at the beginning of the project, is an assessment of the project's conformance with VCS program rules. This first video deals with 6 validation obstacles in particular: terminology use, stakeholder engagement, ownership and maps, timing, additionality tests, and finally, project activity definitions. As this New York Times article from 28 December 2023 suggests, not only forest carbon auditors, but auditors of all types must balance upholding standard requirements against satisfying paying customers. This is a hard balance to achieve and often errs with either strict standard adherence and client offense or lenient standard adherence and client assuagement. I hope this video inspires project developers to design and execute more rigorous forest carbon projects to even up this balance. The growth of the forest carbon industry, making trees worth more standing than fallen, depends on sufficient rather than deficient projects. The first obstacle for validation is using exact terminology. For example, VCS distinguishes projects from programs, as programs are forest carbon initiatives led by national or subnational governments, departments, districts, provinces, regions, or states at the subnational level, using policy instruments. My videos will focus on projects and not programs. Projects typically involve 4 parties: a local implementer, a technical developer, and a proponent who typically finances, manages, and owns the project, defined by VCS as having the overall control and responsibility. The fourth party is stakeholders, defined by VCS as any person or entity who can potentially materially affect or be affected by the project activities. An ancillary party is interested stakeholders who are not materially affected, such as charities, media, and universities. VCS standard section 3.18.2 requires stakeholders materially affected to be consulted prior to the implementation of project activities in inclusive, culturally appropriate, and respectful fashion. Projects routinely fulfill this VCS requirement through information sessions and handouts. This is not a typical problem I encounter. However, projects often fail on subsequent steps, including section 3.18.3 of the standard. Take due account of all input received. Section 3.18.4, develop a grievance redress procedures to address disputes, particularly in regard to benefit sharing and other safeguards. Section 3.18.5, establish mechanisms for ongoing communication with stakeholders, including records of comments received and addressed. This, indeed, is the second validation obstacle: obtaining and documenting, in the words of the UNFCCC carbon decision from Cancun, the full and effective participation of relevant stakeholders. Local community stakeholders must not only be informed about the project, but must have some role in its design and implementation, bottom up as well as top down, via an ongoing mechanism for communication and grievance redress. The third validation obstacle is ownership and maps. The VCS defines two types of ownership: project ownership to control and operate activities, including monitoring for the project crediting or verification period, and proof of right, which implies right of use. Documents demonstrating the entity's right to all and any GHG emission reductions and removals. Proof of right per standard 3.7.1.6 must be an enforceable and irrevocable agreement with the holder of the statutory property or contractual rights in the land. Note that in addition to project area, boundary, and zone, these all have distinct terminology. The project area is the geographic area in which the project activities are implemented, whereas the project boundary includes greenhouse gas SSRs, sources, sinks, and reservoirs. And finally, the project zone includes a buffer zone for wetland restoration conservation projects and a linkage belt or leakage management area. Digital mapping is also required. Standard 3.11.2.3 requires a KML Google Earth file with geodetic polygons that precisely delineate the project zone of the AFLU project, agriculture, forestry, and other land use, including each instance for a group project, which is a temporal instance. Note that location details of each polygon must also be included with the digital map. The fourth obstacle then is timing. Forest carbon project development from idea inception typically takes a minimum of 2 years, including a 6-month validation period going back and forth with the auditor. Gathering sufficient evidence to respond to VVVs should not be delayed, as lengthy delays during this back and forth period may inadvertently result in provisionally closed findings being reopened due to updates with pertinent VCS documents. Furthermore, AFLU projects must initiate pipeline listing with the VCS within 3 years of project start date and validation within 5 years, with some exceptions. The project start date, per standard 3.8, is the date on which the project can provide documentary evidence that the project activities began generating greenhouse gas emission reductions or removals. Minimum project length for AFLU projects is now 40 years, which means MRV must occur for that period of time, along with the project activities. Although crediting period can only be 20 years renewable, having a crediting period shorter than the 40-year length of the project minimum duration raises immediate questions about impermanence risk, as this would reduce the revenue stream to half the length of the cost stream. The fifth validation obstacle is additionality. Applicable VCS methodologies will dictate additionality tests. All projects must demonstrate regulatory surplus, in other words, exceeding local and national regulatory requirements for forest land management. A new type of additionality test involves a positive list of activities or interventions listed in the applicable methodology, paired with a dynamic performance benchmark. As long as the project generates greenhouse gas emissions less than or sequesters greater than statistically matched references or controls, the project activities are then automatically additional. A more common project-specific additionality test, at least historically common, from the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism of the UN, required 3 realistic and credible scenarios. First, a historical continuation of business as usual for the property. Second, the project activity without carbon finance. And third, the project activity with the finance. The 3 scenarios must be compared with financial or technical barrier analysis, and then finally compared to common practice to qualitatively test additionality. The final validation obstacle, number 6, will continue in the successive video regarding project activity definition. In the meantime, enjoy this short clip of elephants gambling in a mud bath. Thank you.